In May of 1999, a young girl would make her way to the police station in Hong Kong. She would tell the police that she had been tortured by the ghost of a woman who was bloody and beaten, and she was just covered in blood. At first, the police thought this was just a young girl who was just speaking nonsense. Maybe she was struggling mentally. Maybe she was just trying to get some kind of attention. But then eventually, this young girl would go on to say that this was a woman in her 20s who had been murdered. And not just that, she was murdered, tortured by this young girl and a few other people, and she knew exactly what happened. And that's when the police took this very, very serious. Then the police would go with this young girl to this rundown apartment. They would search the third floor, and what they found was horrifying. They found this Hello Kitty mermaid plushie covered in blood. And then when they opened it up, they found a woman's severed head. And this is this horrible, horrible story of the Hello Kitty murder. Hi, welcome to the Decomposing Flower podcast. I'm your host, Jen. With me is Kira. In this podcast, we talk about true crime, true events, anything we find interesting or disturbing. And in today, we're going to be talking about the Hello Kitty murder. I want to give a few disclaimers and some trigger warnings. This episode is pretty heavy. It is very gruesome, and I suggest that if you have any kind of trauma regarding sexual assault or abuse or rape, that this case might not be for you. I'm going to give a few trigger warnings: murder, torture, sexual abuse. We're going to be talking about drugs, and we are going to be talking about rape. And if that is just too close to home, I suggest that you watch another episode or take care of yourself and maybe watch something that is lighter. You don't have to watch this one if this is too much for you. A little disclaimer, all of this information I found is online, and if anything I say is wrong, incorrect, please feel free to let me know. I also want to say that I mean no harm to anyone who has been affected by this case. I am not here to talk about this case for entertainment. This is a serious case, and this was a real woman who was murdered. This is not just a story. I also would like to say that I do not speak Chinese, and if I do get any of the names wrong, if I just say them really terribly, I'm so sorry. I'm trying really hard. But if you feel like you need to correct me in the comments, feel free to. I would love to learn. So with that, I think we can begin. So Fan Man Yi, and I'm just going to refer to her as Fan, I would describe her life as an overall struggle. There isn't much about her, but what I do know is that her life was just really terrible. At a young age, she was already abandoned by her family. A lot of people don't really know why she was abandoned, so I don't know if her family abandoned her because they wanted to or if they just had to, but she was then raised in an all-girl only orphanage. When Fan was 15 years old, she was forced to leave this orphanage, which most places like foster care homes or situations like that, usually they don't let you stay past 16 even though you're still a child. And so she became homeless very, very quickly. And like most people, when they become homeless, they get addicted to drugs because it's really hard to live that lifestyle. And on top of this, she was also doing sex work. She was a prostitute. Some say it's because she needed to pay for the drugs. I don't know if she did sex work and then became addicted or if it kind of became both. Overall, it doesn't really matter which came first. That's what she had to do, and that was the only way she could kind of live. And so she was living a real hard life. At 21, she began to work in a brothel. Fan would end up marrying this client that she had, who was not a nice man. He was a drug addict, and he was overall very abusive to her. Her neighbors would go on to say that they would wake up to hearing her cry, which I just think is so sad, knowing that she was crying and no one really helped her. But again, I don't know the laws in China, and so this is also 1999. I don't know if there's different laws in how they work there, and so I don't want to pass judgment or anything onto the neighbors because I don't know if it's different. But her husband overall was not a nice man, and in 2 years of their marriage, she ended up giving birth to her son. Her son was kind of the main reason of her wanting to change her life. She wanted to give her son a good life. She wanted to give this little boy a chance and to give him a proper life, and she wanted to protect him. So she ended up leaving her husband, and she wasn't really making a lot of money. She was very poor. And so she quit drugs and she got a job as a hostess at a nightclub. Now, I don't know exactly what kind of nightclub this was. She was definitely doing sex work. So I don't think she was just like a waitress. Maybe she was both. I don't know. She ended up doing a lot of sex work just to make some money because she needed to get her life back. Since Fan was very, very poor, she had this one client and he was pretty regular and he had a lot of money. And at that time, she decided that she was going to steal his money and she was going to steal his wallet. And so this client, his name was Chan Man Lok. I'm so sorry if I'm saying that wrong. I'll refer to him as Chan. He was very rich and kind of important. He was part of the triad groups, which is basically like the Chinese mafia. And he was already like pretty problematic. He had a lot of issues going all the way back to middle school. And he, in 1991, was already convicted of drug trafficking. Chan had become basically Fan's number one client. And when he noticed that 4,000 Hong Kong dollars had been missing from his wallet, which is equivalent to 500 USD at the time, he was pissed, obviously. He was like, where's my money? So he goes to Fan and he demands to know what happened to his money and for her to return the money. So she goes, okay, I will return it. But he also wanted her to pay a fee of an extra 10,000 Hong Kong dollars. And when she did return the money, she didn't have the 10,000. And so he was like, I need that money. And she went on to explain to him, listen, I'll get it back to you. I just need some time. I can't pay it back to you right now. I don't have that kind of money. But that wasn't good enough for Chan. One night when Fan was working the street because she stopped working at this nightclub, most likely because she probably was afraid of Chan because he was very powerful. He had a lot of power. And she probably was afraid that he was gonna like come after her. So she probably was working the street to get away from him or just to like stay out of the way. And maybe she was also working the street because she could make more money. I don't really know enough about that. One night she was working the street and his group of men and this young girl, which we'll get into in a second, had actually kidnapped her. There's a couple different people in this case. So there is Chan, which we've already talked about. He was 33, 34 at the time, and he had a girlfriend. But I'm gonna say girlfriend very loosely because she's honestly a victim. Her identity has been kind of concealed. Her alias was known as Ah Fong, but I'm probably just gonna refer to her as the 13-year-old girlfriend or Fong. But she was 13, and again, he was 33, so 20 years older than her. So just want to say right there, that is definitely not a consenting relationship. A lot of people think that she might have just been a prostitute or one of his prostitutes because, I mean, why is he hanging out with a 13-year-old girl? When I say girlfriend, just know, like, I don't really think she's a girlfriend. I think she's more of a victim, definitely a victim. And a lot of the information we actually get is from this young girl. And then there was these two other guys. One of them was Liang Weilun and Liang Xing Chao. I'm so sorry if you are Chinese and I just said those names really, really bad. I'm sorry. I really am trying. So these men were all in their 20s and their 30s, and they were the ones that took part in this case. So just remember, there's a 33-year-old man, and then there's 20-year-old guys, 30-year-old guys, and then a 13-year-old girl. And then Fan was 23 at the time. So from what we kind of know is that this little young girlfriend basically took parts in this case, but I don't know how much she actually took into it. And I do just again want to make it very clear, like, she was a victim. She was 13. And this guy seems very powerful. And so I don't know if she was like kind of forced into doing this stuff, but I don't know as much as what she really did. Chan had actually rented out this apartment that was very rundown. Think of your most like stereotypical rundown apartment. That's what he was living in. He was living in like this, I don't even think he was actually living in this apartment. He had just rented it out. And I believe he had a wife actually and like a baby, and he was like living there, but he had this like apartment and it was just like very rundown. So originally how he was actually gonna go get his money back was he was gonna run his own little brothel with Fan being the only prostitute, and he was gonna basically pimp her out of this place and pimp her out to his friends, colleagues, people he knew, and even have her as his own prostitute. Like, he was basically sex trafficking. And so the first night was horrible. It began by them raping her all throughout the night into the early morning, and they basically were using Fan as their own personal sex object. They wouldn't just have them rape her, they would also have other men rape her because, again, they were using her as a prostitute and straight up sex trafficking. And these men would come in, rape her, and they would also beat her. And I don't know if like the men paying for her services were beating her, but I know the men that were a part of this case were. When they would beat and rape her severely, it started off with just their hands, and then it kind of got into using objects like furniture, kitchen utensils, honestly anything they could find. And they would tell Fan that she needed to laugh, smile, act like she was enjoying it, and even say that. And if she couldn't do that or wouldn't do that, they would beat her even more and do it harder. So I don't know if this was a way for them to justify what they were doing, or if it was a way to humiliate Van, to make her feel like this is what she wanted. If this was a way like they wanted to be like, oh, she said she liked it. I don't know if they were trying to save their asses. I feel like it was more out of a way to humiliate her and just have full control over her, knowing she didn't actually enjoy any of this. Ah Fong even said that she witnessed them kicking Fan in the head 50 times, which is crazy and so horrible. Like I said, they beat her with weapons, furniture, metal bars. They used kitchen utensils on her. I don't know if they used them in her or if they used them as even objects to sexually assault her. If Fan had any types of cuts or wounds, they would actually mix spices and dirt and food into her wounds. And I just can't even imagine what that could do to someone. This is like not even like the worst of it, obviously, but this in itself could really could kill someone in itself because the infection she could have gotten. And also I believe they were putting like cayenne pepper into that, and like that could just burn and all that. They wouldn't feed her. They were starving her. I think if they did feed her, it wasn't like anything. And they also would make her eat and drink her own human waste. I think that they would beat her if she wouldn't do that, or if she reacted in a way they didn't like, they would beat her again. It got to the point where they had beaten her so bad that she wasn't even able to function well for the services, if you know what I mean. She wasn't able to be raped as much anymore because her body was basically giving out on her. A lot of the men didn't also want to have her because she just was so beat up. It got to the point where they wanted to use her as their own personal punching bag. So because they no longer could pimp her out, they all had a little brainstorm session of what they should do to her. And they decided to come up with a creative idea of using wax and hot plastic all over her, including on her legs, her feet, the bottoms of her feet, so that she couldn't really walk or stand up or run away if she ever tried. So the abuse and the rape got to the point where she no longer was reacting. I don't know if this was because she was dissociating or if it was literally because she was dying. I think it's both, but she was no longer reacting to it. And the men were pissed about that because obviously they wanted her to be uncomfortable. A lot of times when someone is like this and they're this evil, they like to know that someone does not enjoy what is happening to them. And that's part of the power, right? They want someone to see that someone's not enjoying it. One of them proposed an idea that they should actually hang her from the ceiling like a punching bag because she couldn't stand up. They literally hoisted her up with electric wire and they tied her wrists behind her back and they kind of hung her up on the ceiling. I think it was on a ceiling fan. They would just leave her like that and then they would beat her and do all kinds of things to her. And sometimes they would leave her like there for hours or overnight. And overall, she just had become nothing to them. Like that's really how she was. She wasn't even like a person to them. She wasn't. I think it no longer became about the money anymore and came about the power. All over 500 USD, by the way, or I guess it was 4,000 Hong Kong dollars, which is just crazy to think this is all over 500 American. I mean, any amount is insane. You shouldn't do this to anyone, obviously, but just thinking about how little it is, I don't think it was ever about the fucking money. I think this guy just is a fucking piece of shit. So between April 14th and the 15th, they all decided to go out to eat. They locked Fan in the bathroom so she couldn't escape. Not like she actually could anyways. So between the 14th and the 15th, this little girl, Ah Fong, she would make her way to the apartment. And when she went into the bathroom, that's when she saw Fan and she had been dead in the bathtub. A lot of people believe that Chan and his group were not actually expecting her to die. This had only been a month of when all this happened. And I think that they weren't actually expecting her to die. I see this a lot in these types of cases where it's like these people don't expect someone to die. And it's like, did you think that they were gonna live forever? Our bodies eventually can't take torture and they eventually die. Whether it's through the actual physical trauma or it's through starvation or anything, they had to come up with a new idea of what to do. But they didn't know. So they kind of left it overnight. And then the next morning, Chan was like, we need to get rid of her body, but we can't just like cut her up in 1 or 2 pieces or just like throw her into the ocean. We got to actually cut her up. And this is where this case is just like, ugh. He wanted to dispose her body so that she wouldn't be easy to identify. And that's when they began to dismember her body in the bathtub. And then they took the other remains, including her head. He decapitated her. And then he took her skull and boiled it on the stove. He waited for all the flesh and the muscle to literally melt away. And once all that was gone, he took her skull and grabbed the famous Hello Kitty mermaid plushie doll and he put her head inside this doll and then sewed it back up, and then they just decided to discard the rest of her body in plastic bags and they put them in dumpsters, and I think they boiled some of the rest and they just tried to get rid of as much evidence as they could. Around a month later in May, that's when the young 13-year-old girl, at the time I think she had just turned 14 now, she had been getting these nightmares of this young woman, which was Fan, and Fan was like covered in blood and she was basically just being tormented with her, and so she couldn't handle it anymore and she finally went to the police. So she goes to the police and at first they're kind of like, we don't really believe you, you're just speaking nonsense. I think they thought that she had some kind of mental disorder or something going on, but they eventually listened to her when she said, I actually know who the victim was and I took part in the murder. The police are like, okay, we need to go to this place. So when they get into the apartment, it's like just overall messy, and then they find the Hello Kitty doll, and that's when they open it up and they see her head. I guess it was her skull. And then they also found parts of her body. I think there were some of her organs and her one tooth. And then they found parts of her other body in dumpsters and trash cans, and they said it was the most disturbing thing they've ever witnessed in their career. So because her body had been dismembered, the police didn't know the true cause of her death because they couldn't really technically see, and so they had to try and figure out what really happened. And that's like, Fong had told them everything, but the men had shared their own version of the story, saying that's not what happened. They went on to say, well, technically we were running a brothel and Fan was the prostitute. She was the only one there, but she's on drugs. She is a crazy drug addict and she overdosed and we didn't know what to do. And so we cut her up and we did all that, which obviously the police are already like, that's very suspicious. Like, even if that was the case, like, why would you go as far as that? And they were like, oh, we were just afraid that we were going to be accused of this murder and all of that. And so the police are just like, no. So they were able to arrest these men with manslaughter. They couldn't have direct evidence, but the court and the trial did come back saying that she did die under their care. They were charged with manslaughter. The young 14-year-old girl, she actually got a plea deal. Basically, this plea deal was, if you tell us everything, you won't get charged with anything. And that's what she did. And some of the information that actually happened to Fan has been kept away from the public as part of the plea deal. So I don't know if there were certain things that happened with the 14-year-old girl that they wouldn't share. I'm not too sure. Or if it was just very gruesome. But honestly, I don't think we need to know everything, because even just the small details, even though they're small, they're still horrendous. A case does not have to have a long-winded story for it to be horrendous for what it's done. It's just, ugh. So these men all got life sentences and they all had to see a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist said that all these men had no remorse, that they had no empathy, and they overall were not good people. So they were able to identify the skull by using photo overlapping method, and they were able to identify it as Fan, and they actually were able to connect with her birth family, but not till March 2004. And then her skull was actually cremated on March 26. She actually had a necklace that was found in the fridge, and they were able to give that to her little boy, and obviously he doesn't remember her because I think he was like 5 months old. Like he was just a baby. Like he obviously wouldn't be able to remember her. Because of Ah Fong mentioning that she had been haunted by Fan's ghost, many people believed that they could contact Fan and would go to this like apartment building and would try to talk to her. Now, I don't really know if people were doing it because they're wanting to know the truth, if they really believe it, but I think that's crossing the line. No matter who it is, I just don't agree with that. I don't think that's appropriate at all. But eventually people started to turn it almost into like this little like circus, like just causing a lot of disrespect towards Fan. Like they were almost mocking her. And so the apartment building was actually demolished in 2012. But then it was rebuilt in 2016 as a hotel, which I just think is kind of weird and scary. But there were 3 Buddha portraits in this hotel as a memorial for her, I assume. So Chan and these men are still serving their life sentences, except one of the men, he actually was able to push his sentence down to 18 years, but was eventually actually released in April of 2014. And then in August of 2022, was arrested for sexually assaulting a 10-year-old girl. That's what the men have been doing. I hope the other 2 don't get out. I hope that little girl, the 14-year-old, was able to fix her life and hopefully is doing okay. This is pretty traumatic for her. I just wanted to talk about it and just kind of remember Fan. It's really sad that her life was like this. It's sad because I don't get to know enough about her. Usually when we do these episodes on true crime, we like to kind of talk about the victim and who they are, but there wasn't a whole lot on her. And yeah, so if anyone does know more about her, I'd be curious to learn about her, and if I did get anything wrong, please feel free to let me know, and we will see you in another episode.